Hi, and welcome to this mini course on the transmission of rabbinic texts. I wanted to do a series specifically on transmission because one of the things that I discovered in the course of doing academic graduate work in Talmud is that the practical questions of what we know about how different rabbinic collections were transmitted from the time that they were composed through the Gaonim, through the time of the Rishonim, and even through modern times. They are both often fascinating stories and ones that really give a flavor for the journey that Torah, in a larger sense, traveled from Eretz Israel to Bavel to Europe and across different parts of Europe and into the modern period. So the stories are often fascinating and revealing. They are generally not only ignored, but before I really knew these stories and hadn't even really thought about them. So they're really sort of just, they're under the radar, and they have a surprisingly large influence on on understanding the development of rabbinic Torah. And there are features of what happened in various periods whose key is there in plain sight if you know to look for it. We're not going to talk about transmission kind of as a general thing and look at different aspects of it that way. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the different rabbinic collections and sort of quickly see the basics of each collection's story, what we know about how it was transmitted over time and from place to place. And in doing so, we will see some of the important patterns and guidelines that are important to understand about transmission of ancient texts as a more general phenomenon. So we're going to start with the beginning with the Mishna and Tosefta, two collections that were edited and completed at around the same time and are intimately connected with each other, but had very, very different journeys. We'll look at the collections of Midrash, of the Tannaitic Midrash Halacha, and the Amoraic Midrash Haggadah. We'll talk a little bit about the Talmud Yerushalmi. I will hit the highlights of the transmission of the Yerushalmi here. I'm not going to go into detail about that because it is a long and fascinating story that I spend a chunk of time going through in my mini course on the Yerushalmi. So I invite you to get the full story there. But we'll get the kind of the chapter headings here. We'll talk about the transmission of the Bavli, both its transition from being the oral province of the Gaonic academies to being put into writing, and then eventually being sent to communities in North Africa and Europe, at which point they become fundamentally written texts that are studied in writing, transmitted in writing, and are fully written texts, whereas even once they were written in Babylonia, they were still primarily oral. So we'll look at the Bavli. We'll look at the transmission of the Sidur, which The Siddur also originated in Babylonia and was sent in roughly the same time period and in roughly the same way, actually, as the Bavli to communities in Europe, but how the Siddur was received and used and transmitted once in Europe was quite different. So we'll talk about that. And we will talk about the transmission of the commentaries of the various medieval commentators, the Rishonim. And this is a piece, again, that I remember hadn't even, a question it hadn't even occurred to me to ask before I really started working on this more in depth. There were many Rishonim who wrote about halakha, who sort of wrote explanations of the Talmud in the early medieval period from the 11th century through the 15th, 16th. Some of them were widely disseminated and widely studied. Some of them were infrequently copied, disseminated, studied. Some of them were completely lost, either forever or lost until a lone manuscript was rediscovered in the 20th century that hadn't been known since essentially the time of its composition, meaning that we have a commentary that we can study, but that was not part of the was not known by any of the subsequent Rishonim who came after. And hopefully in going through those different the collections and their paths, we'll see some of the different issues that transmission brings up and some of the different ways that these different paths of transmission shape the rabbinic curriculum. Okay, so to start, the Mishnah. The Mishnah seems like the simplest story. It is it's really the only text prior to the Gaonim. Gaonim, I mean 8th to 11th century Babylonia. Right? It is the only text prior to the Gaonim where we pretty much know and there is consensus on when it was edited, finalized, and who did so. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compiled, edited the Mishnah early in the 3rd century, in the 200s CE. So what is there to talk about? So the first thing, Saul Lieberman was the first to realize and call attention to the fact that the Mishnah has clear signs of being composed as an oral text meant for recitation and being transmitted as an oral text. Not only is there no record of there being written versions of the Mishnah, there's lots of evidence to suggest that no such thing existed. The Mishnah was published orally. That was a shock to a lot of people because people you normally think of oral texts as being less faithfully preserved, but in the context of an oral memorization culture, the opposite turns out to be the case. Written texts, as they're being copied over and transmitted, can be misread, or errors can creep in, all sorts of things when a teaching or even a whole corpus is memorized. The person memorizing understands all of the words, and then when they teach it, not only are they going to be more precise, but they can convey the meaning and not just the words. The written words are, in a sense, disembodied. in a way that oral teaching is not. So the Mishnah exhibits a very high degree of fixity of the text, despite or because of it being exclusively oral. Now, we think the Mishnah was published and then it was immediately the defining thing, everything changed. Didn't exactly work like that. There was some period of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's Mishnah gaining kind of primacy over other collections of Tanaitic halacha, but it did gain acceptance pretty quickly, certainly over the century after it was completed. Over time, the Mishnah becomes the central kind of defining text of the rabbinic curriculum. So the Mishnah becomes the starting point for all further conversation, all further study. That means that it is read in sort of the way that we think of reading Tanakh. And what I mean by that is that it's read very carefully. It is assuming that it is the authoritative text, and everything else is just is ancillary. The Mishnah, when you see how the Talmud reads the Mishnah, first of all, when you open up a Talmud, the Mishnah is broken up into little units, each of which has pages of Talmud. Right? By the time you get from one Mishnah to the next Mishnah, you don't have a sense of the Mishnayot as being a continuity, even though originally, of course, the Mishnah was a single composition that was meant to be read, to read fluidly through a whole chapter, through a whole Masechta. And that's not just our experience. The Amoraim read the Mishnah this way. And this is another important way that the Mishnah is treated like Tanakh. Scholars often say that the Midrash in reading Bible texts has two modes. They have hyperlocal, really reading a verse at maximum two verses, kind of on their own, isolated from context, and hyper and universal, reading a pasuk in the context of the entire Tanakh, where connections between a verse in Shemot and one in Daniel or Joel or Psalms is as relevant, or at least almost as relevant, as another verse in Exodus or another verse even in that chapter. And certainly, so the Mishnah is often read the same way, that each Mishnah is read on its own. Often a single line of the Mishnah is discussed and debated and analyzed kind of on its own, even in isolation from the rest of that Mishnah. And certainly there's less of a sense of the continuous nature and the connection between Mishnayot of a chapter. This also means that when we get to medieval Europe, you rarely find, say, text manuscripts of just the Mishnah. The Mishnah is always studied embedded in the Talmud. In fact, I'm going to just quickly show you. Here you go. Show you this. This is the Kaufman manuscript of the Mishnah. And the thing to see about it, first of all, are only two basically full manuscripts of the Mishnah that have been found in Europe, despite the fact that the Mishnah was the base text, the text that everyone knew, right? It was almost never studied on its own. There are a small number of early Rishonim who studied the Mishnah on its own, who wrote commentary on the Mishnah. They are few and far between. But also, notice, this seems to be significant, although I don't want to read too much into it, but that this Mishnah text has nikud, has vowels. It is one of the only rabbinic texts that was that we have copied with vowels, and that reinforces the sense that the Mishnah was seen kind of as certainly by the Goanim, and once you get into medieval Europe, as having quasi-scriptural status. Okay, so that's the now. Now let's talk about. We're going to talk about the Tosefta. Tosefta was collected and edited in the same time as the Mishnah, sort of certainly as in terms of the collection, shortly later than, a little bit later than the Mishnah, but not a lot later. All language evidence points to the Tosefta being authentically the product of the late Tanaim. The thing, though, is that not only do we not know specifics about its compiling or completion, we have no trace of this as an identified named collection at all. We know that the Amoraim of in the Yerushalmi knew the Tosefta. They knew lots of halachot from the Tosefta, but it's hard to imagine, given that it was composed in those towns, academies, in that community, and that it survived, that they had it and used it. There's been debate about that only because the Yerushalmi tends to will often paraphrase a Tosefta as opposed to quoting it verbatim. But they have the Tosefta presumably in the form that we have it, although we can't prove that. But then we get to Babylonia. The Babylonian rabbis have the Mishnah shortly after it's composed. We know that Rav, a first generation Babylonian Mora, had been studying in Eretz Yisrael under Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and then leaves to return to Babel and brings the Mishnah. So they have been studying the Mishnah. It has now been established, this is kind of a recent piece of scholarship, that the Babylonians have the Yerushalmi as of the end of the 4th century, not long after the Yerushalmi is completed, because we can see that there is a shift, a very marked shift in the types of teachings attributed to the early generations of Babylonian Amoraim and the teachings attributed to later Amoraim from after the time the Yerushalmi seems to have arrived, right? The later ones are responding to whole Yerushalmi sugyot, and the early ones do not. But the Tosefta doesn't seem to arrive in Bavel until the very end of the Talmudic period. They knew some of the Breitot, maybe in different forms, maybe just pieces, but the Tosefta as a collection arrives much later. This is, by the way, the reason, the fact that we don't have any clear evidence of the Babylonians having the Tosefta during most of the Talmudic period. There are no real, except for maybe one thing that who knows what it really means. There are no references to this collection or book called the Tosefta. While there are many sugyot in the Bavli that quote Brightot from the Tosefta, some of those are actually Yerushalmi sugyot that used the Tosefta, and so they got it from the Yerushalmi. And others are very late, are later sugyot that don't involve a moraim. And in fact, in some cases, you have a Yerushalmi sugya that had paraphrased a Tosefta, and the Bavli has kind of like taken and adapted that sugya, and then it seems kind of later they insert the full quote of the Tosefta, and because they didn't have it until a later point in its transmission. We have no idea how that's possible, really. Like, how did that work? I don't have a story for you, but it's the fact that it seems so strange is part of the reason why there's been so much debate and confusion about it. Where was this text? But we know that it is in Babylonia as of, say, the 6th century. It is still it is attested in as a collection in Gaonic writings as of the 8th century. So by the time of the Gaonim, it is clearly a text that is known, that is used, that is referred to. And it would seem that the Tosefta, unlike the Mishnah, had to have existed in writing from a much earlier time, simply because we know that it was preserved from the 3rd century to the 6th century and into the period of the Gaonim in pretty close to its original form without being regularly studied and analyzed. So sort of written texts have to figure in there somewhere, although we can't really say exactly how. The Tosefta makes its way to Europe along with the Talmud. It is definitely known. Rishonim there aren't a lot of copies of the Tosefta, but we do have evidence in the writings of Rishonim that they have the Tosefta, and they will sometimes refer to, they will certainly, Rashi and other early Rishonim will refer to, this teaching is from the Tosefta, or in the Tosefta there's a different version of this, much more often than they will refer explicitly to, say, the Yerushalmi, or to, especially the Yerushalmi. So they definitely have it and they use it, but it's still relatively rare. Just like in the Bavli, one of the reasons people kind of wanted to suggest that the Tosefta was compiled very late, it's to the end of the Talmudic period. So they assumed that if the Babylonians knew the Tosefta already, they would have used it in lots more places. There are lots of places of Mishnayot on which the Tosefta has a relevant teaching that both Talmuds ignore. There are lots of places where the Talmudim ask questions to which the Tosefta would seem to have an answer. Right? In the case of the Bavli, that's explained by the fact that for most of that time, the Babylonians simply didn't have the Tosefta, even though it had been completed long since. In the case of the Rishonim, the Tosefta was kind of marginal to the agenda of rabbinic study, and there's a certain ideology that was expressed famously by Rav Hai Gaon with regard to the Yerushalmi that kind of also gets applied to the Tosefta, which is that fundamentally, here's the irony, is Rav Hai Gaon asserts basically the opposite of what turns out to be the real story of the Tosefta, which is he asserts that, well, the Amoraim in Babylonia, they knew the Tosefta. If they thought it was important, they would have quoted it. So Rishonim tend to assume, not 100%, but often assume that a teaching in the Tosefta that is ignored by the Bavli was ignored because it was deemed not correct or not relevant. If the Tosefta has a different version of a particular Braita than the Bavli's version is considered more authoritative. The place where the Tosefta is most obviously relevant is when there's the version in the Bavli is either cut off and the Tosefta version is fuller, or the version in the Bavli is confusing or unclear, and the Tosefta has a version that is more clear. And there were, as with other texts, there were certain Rishonim who understood and appreciated the value of having independent witnesses to some of these traditions, and the value of comparing them and thinking through the differences, especially when they diverge. There were certain Rishonim who really appreciated that value. The Tosefta existed in medieval Europe in relatively small number of copies, so it was a text that was known more or less widely, but not that everyone had a copy. It was a text that would be consulted when you had the opportunity. The change in that was that ultimately, partially because the Tosefta is is 3 times as long as the Mishna. Right? When you put them side by side, right? And the Tosefta is 3 times much more discursive and sort of whole collections and digressions that are kind of cut out of the Mishnah, but far, far, far shorter than the Gemara. And in the context of the Gemara, it's a very short text. And once the Talmud you have the advent of the printing press, shortly thereafter, the Tosefta starts getting printed at the back of a particular Masechta of Talmud. And so starting from that point, the Tosefta is more readily available to students of the Talmud, and because it's right there in the book, more regularly consulted. When we get to Rishonim, we will talk more about the availability heuristic, the way that how often a particular Rishon is consulted based on where and how it was copied or printed. That is certainly true for the Tosefta. The Tosefta also was, and the last thing I'll say about it, the Tosefta was the first text to get major sort of piece by piece analysis by a modern scholar. Saul Lieberman, his kind of magnum opus really is his absolutely astonishingly detailed analysis of the Tosefta. It was the first text that really was used to shine a critical lens on the Bavli to be able to, right, because the way you do critical scholarship on any ancient text is that the best way is having a context of other contemporaneous texts within which to read it, either source texts or alternative parallels, so that you can have some basis for questioning for seeing how things have been changed or altered or reread, etc. So the Tosefta was the first text that really allowed a scholar to kind of shine a critical light on the Bavli, and particularly the Brightot in the Bavli, and through sort of meticulous comparison. Okay, so that's the Mishna and Tosefta. Next, we'll go on to Midrashim.